Every person carries within them a hidden dimension of the self, one that is often uncomfortable to confront. Carl Jung, one of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century, named this the shadow. It is composed of the traits, desires, and impulses we repress because they feel unacceptable, shameful, or dangerous. The shadow is not necessarily evil, though it may contain destructive urges. It is simply what we refuse to see or admit in ourselves. By ignoring it, we risk allowing it to control us unconsciously. By facing it, we gain a deeper awareness of who we truly are. Philosophy, psychology, and religion have all recognized this duality within the human condition. Jung argued that integration of the shadow is a central step in individuation, the process of becoming a whole and authentic person. Nietzsche spoke of confronting our inner chaos in order to give birth to what he called a dancing star, a metaphor for creation through struggle. Kierkegaard warned of the despair that comes from denying one's true self, including the darker elements we'd rather avoid. Hannah Arendt, reflecting on the horrors of the 20th century, pointed to the banality of evil, the way ordinary people, by refusing to examine their darker impulses, can perpetuate harm without realizing it. Religious traditions also recognize this struggle. Christianity frames it as the battle against sin, calling believers to confession, repentance, and redemption. Buddhism views the shadow through the lens of craving, ignorance, and attachment, urging mindful awareness rather than suppression. In Islam, the concept of jihad al-nafs describes the moral struggle against the destructive forces of the ego, emphasizing discipline and self-examination. Literature echoes these insights with powerful metaphors. Shakespeare's Macbeth is consumed by ambition, a shadow he fails to master, while Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde depicts the terrifying consequences of splitting the self into respectable and monstrous halves. Khalil Gibran, in The Prophet, reminds us that joy and sorrow, light and darkness are inseparably woven into the human soul. To deny one side is to deny life itself. This episode will examine how facing the shadow self, rather than fleeing it, can transform our lives. We will see that the shadow is not an enemy to destroy, but a teacher to learn from. To live authentically, we must embrace both our light and our darkness, integrating them into a more complete, honest self. This journey is uncomfortable, even frightening, but it is necessary if we hope to move beyond denial, projection, and self-deception. The shadow waits for each of us. The question is whether we will face it, or let it rule us from the depths. The concept of the shadow originates with Carl Jung, who described it as the part of the psyche that contains everything we refuse to acknowledge. These may include negative traits like anger, envy, or selfishness, but also positive qualities we suppress out of fear or shame. The shadow is formed through repression, the process of pushing unwanted thoughts, feelings, or desires into the unconscious. It grows quietly in the background, often shaping behavior more than we realize. The shadow reveals itself in subtle ways. When we overreact to others, it often reflects something unacknowledged within ourselves. When we find ourselves judging harshly, we may be rejecting a trait we secretly share. Even dreams and fantasies expose the shadow, showing us parts of the self that our waking mind resists. Philosophers and psychologists alike have long wrestled with the dark side of human nature. Friedrich Nietzsche spoke of embracing the beast within, warning that denying our instincts only makes them more dangerous. Sigmund Freud identified repression as the root of neuroses, arguing that what is buried eventually returns in distorted ways. Religious traditions also recognize this truth. Christianity speaks of original sin and the need for confession, while Buddhism describes the poisons of greed, hatred, and delusion that must be confronted. Islam, too, emphasizes the inner jihad, the struggle against the lower self. The shadow is not purely destructive. It holds untapped potential, energy, and creativity. The traits we bury are often the very ones that could lead to growth if properly integrated. The artist who represses rage may later channel it into art. The leader who denies vulnerability may find strength in admitting it. Understanding the shadow means acknowledging that we are not purely good or purely bad, but complex mixtures of both. To deny the shadow is to live half a life, blind to our own depths. To confront it is to step into a fuller, more authentic existence. The shadow asks us to see what we would rather not see. But in that seeing lies transformation. The shadow begins in childhood, when certain traits are deemed unacceptable. A child who shows anger may be told they are bad. A child who shows vulnerability may be told to toughen up. Over time, these lessons create a hidden self. The parts of us that parents, teachers, or peers reject are tucked away into the unconscious. This is the foundation of the shadow. Culture plays a powerful role. Societies establish norms of behavior, dividing traits into what is praised and what is condemned. Aggression may be rewarded in one culture but punished in another. Expressions of sexuality may be repressed in one community yet openly accepted in another. These cultural rules shape what we allow ourselves to show and what we bury deep inside. Philosophers recognized this dynamic long before Jung. Plato suggested that individuals must wrestle with appetites and desires that threaten harmony of the soul. Aristotle warned of vices born when virtues fall out of balance. More recently, existentialist thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre emphasized the danger of bad faith, the refusal to acknowledge the truth of one's being. Religious traditions also highlight repression and temptation. In Christianity, the Apostle Paul lamented, "I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do." In Hinduism, the Bhagavad Gita describes the inner battle between higher and lower natures. In Islam, the nafs, the ego self, must be restrained and transformed. These teachings echo the idea that ignoring the shadow only increases its power. The shadow is therefore not accidental, it is shaped by the interplay of self, family, and culture. Every time we suppress a part of who we are, the shadow grows. This does not mean repression is always harmful. It allows us to function in society, to cooperate, and maintain order. But when repression becomes excessive, the shadow gains strength in unhealthy ways. By examining the roots of the shadow, we better understand why it is so universal. No one escapes it. To be human is to carry hidden parts of ourselves. The challenge lies not in eliminating them, but in bringing them into awareness with compassion and honesty. Throughout literature, the shadow has been a recurring theme. Writers across centuries have grappled with the darkness within, creating characters and stories that embody the struggles of the hidden self. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is one of the clearest examples. Dr. Frankenstein's creation is his shadow, the rejected part of himself brought to life, demanding recognition. The creature represents everything denied, yet it cannot be destroyed without consequence. Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde dramatizes the duality of human nature. Jekyll, the respectable doctor, represses his darker impulses, only for them to erupt as Hyde, uncontrollable and destructive. The story illustrates the danger of trying to separate the shadow instead of integrating it. Shakespeare also explored the shadow in his tragedies. Macbeth is consumed by ambition he cannot control. Othello's jealousy blinds him to truth. Hamlet wrestles with hesitation and rage. These plays reveal that the failure to confront the shadow leads to ruin. Even ancient myths reflect this theme. In Greek mythology, the figure of Hades rules the underworld, a symbolic shadow realm. The hero's descent into the underworld often represents a journey into the unconscious, where hidden truths must be faced. Joseph Campbell later described this as part of the hero's journey, confronting darkness before achieving transformation. Literary shadows resonate because they reflect real struggles. When readers encounter Hyde, the monster, or the jealous lover, they are glimpsing their own repressed traits. Stories externalize the shadow, making it visible, so we can wrestle with it in symbolic form. The shadow in literature reminds us that darkness is not separate from humanity, but woven into its fabric. Every great character contains contradictions, light and dark entwined. By reading such works, we gain insight into our own lives. Literature serves as a mirror, reflecting the hidden dimensions we might otherwise ignore. Religious traditions across the world recognize the reality of the shadow, even if they use different names. Christianity frames it as sin, impulses that separate humans from God. Augustine wrote of the divided will, the part of the soul that longs for goodness yet is drawn toward vice. The concept of confession and repentance acknowledges the need to bring hidden darkness into the light. Without that honesty, the shadow festers in secrecy. In Buddhism, the shadow aligns with the three poisons: greed, hatred, and delusion. These are not external enemies, but internal states of mind that cloud awareness and perpetuate suffering. Meditation and mindfulness serve as tools to observe these impulses without judgment, allowing transformation through awareness. Islam speaks of the nafs, the lower self, which struggles against the higher call of the spirit. The inner jihad, the greater struggle, is the battle to discipline the ego and confront one's darker tendencies. This inner struggle is framed as both moral and spiritual, a reminder that every person carries shadow traits within them. Hinduism too speaks of shadow elements in the form of desires and attachments that bind the self to illusion, Maya. The Bhagavad Gita presents the battlefield as both literal and metaphorical, where Arjuna must confront not only his enemies, but his own inner turmoil. This text illustrates that the path to liberation requires engaging with inner shadows rather than denying them. Religious traditions agree on one key point: to ignore the darker aspects of self is dangerous. Whether through sin, poison, ego, or illusion, the shadow is seen as an obstacle to spiritual wholeness. Yet, paradoxically, these traditions also affirm that transformation is possible. Through prayer, meditation, repentance, or discipline, the shadow can become a teacher. By examining the shadow through religion, we see that it is not just psychological but spiritual. To confront the shadow is to engage in a sacred act, aligning oneself more closely with truth, compassion, and divine reality. The shadow is not simply an enemy, it is a pathway to redemption. The shadow shows itself not only in extraordinary crises, but in the ordinary details of daily life. It appears when we gossip about others, not realizing we are projecting our own insecurities. It surfaces when jealousy makes us quietly resent a friend's success, even as we smile and congratulate them. These are not random flaws, but signals of what we hide from ourselves. At work, the shadow thrives in competition and rivalry. An employee may undermine a colleague out of envy, but justify it as ambition. Leaders may bully others, cloaking it in authority, while masking their own sense of inadequacy. These behaviors reveal how shadows infiltrate even professional environments. In family life, the shadow is passed down unconsciously. Parents may project their repressed fears onto children, enforcing rules rooted not in wisdom but in unresolved trauma. Siblings may replay old conflicts without realizing they mirror generational wounds. These hidden dynamics create cycles of tension that echo across generations. Romantic relationships are perhaps the clearest stage for the shadow. A partner may accuse another of faults that, in truth, they themselves carry. In moments of anger, people often say the very things they fear about themselves. The closer the bond, the more the shadow emerges, demanding to be seen. Even small interactions reveal the shadow. A sharp word, a defensive reaction, a passive-aggressive comment, all are traces of something beneath the surface. The shadow is not distant. It walks beside us in every decision, every conflict, every judgment. Recognizing this requires humility. It means pausing to ask, why does this behavior bother me so deeply? What part of myself does this mirror? These questions are uncomfortable, but they hold the key to awareness. The more we recognize the shadow in everyday life, the less power it has to control us unconsciously. Awareness transforms ordinary struggles into opportunities for self-discovery. Shadow work is the deliberate process of confronting and integrating the hidden aspects of ourselves. Rather than repressing or ignoring them, shadow work asks us to face them with courage and honesty. Carl Jung argued that individuation, becoming a whole person, requires acknowledging the shadow as part of the self. Without this, we remain fragmented. Shadow work often begins with self-inquiry. Questions such as, what do I most fear others discovering about me? Or, what traits in others provoke my strongest reactions? Open the door to hidden truths. Journaling can help bring unconscious material into awareness. Therapy provides a safe space to explore repressed feelings. Practices like meditation allow us to observe the shadow without judgment. A key principle of shadow work is compassion. The goal is not to condemn ourselves for having dark impulses, but to understand them. Anger may reveal a need for boundaries. Jealousy may point to unfulfilled desires. Fear may highlight areas where growth is possible. When understood, these traits lose their destructive power and gain constructive meaning. Integration is not about elimination, but transformation. A selfish impulse, when acknowledged, can become healthy self-care. Aggression can become assertiveness. Even shame, when faced, can turn into humility and empathy. The shadow becomes an ally when we learn to channel its energy into positive forms. Religious and philosophical traditions echo this insight. In Christianity, confession is not only about sin, but also about reclaiming grace. In Buddhism, observing the poisons with awareness turns them into wisdom. Nietzsche argued that one must embrace even the darkest instincts to achieve greatness. These teachings point to the same truth. Integration leads to wholeness. Shadow work is ongoing. The shadow will never fully disappear, but our relationship with it can change. The more we face it, the freer we become from unconscious patterns. In this way, shadow work is not only psychological but also spiritual, a journey toward authenticity and inner harmony. Projection is one of the clearest signs of the shadow at work. When we deny a trait within ourselves, we often project it onto others. A person who represses anger may constantly accuse others of being hostile. Someone who hides their arrogance may call others prideful. In this way, the shadow disguises itself by appearing in the outside world. Carl Jung noted that projection is both a defense mechanism and a revelation. It defends the ego from uncomfortable truths by placing them elsewhere. Yet it also reveals precisely what we are unwilling to acknowledge. The people who irritate us most often mirror what we fear or repress within ourselves. In relationships, projection can be destructive. A partner who fears abandonment may accuse the other of being distant when the real fear lies within themselves. Parents may project their unrealized dreams onto children, burdening them with expectations. In society, projection fuels prejudice, scapegoating, and moral panic. Groups project their own denied weaknesses onto outsiders, labeling them as threats. But projection also offers an opportunity. If we recognize it, we can trace the discomfort back to its source. Asking, "Why does this person bother me so much?" can reveal hidden aspects of the self. By reclaiming projections, we stop distorting reality and begin to understand ourselves more clearly. Projection teaches us that the shadow is not simply inside or outside. It shapes how we see the entire world. To confront projection is to dismantle illusions, reclaim responsibility, and expand awareness. What we resist in others often points directly to what we must face in ourselves. Throughout history, literature has explored the theme of the shadow. Myths, novels, and plays have given shape to the dark side of humanity. These stories reveal not only characters' struggles, but also our own. By reading them, we see our shadows reflected back at us. In Greek tragedy, characters like Oedipus confront shadows of fate and forbidden desire. Shakespeare's plays brim with shadow figures. Macbeth's ambition, Iago's envy, Hamlet's hesitation. Each character externalizes what we wrestle with internally. The plays remain powerful because they dramatize universal shadow conflicts. Modern literature also examines the shadow. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein portrays the monster as the repressed creation of human ambition. Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is a classic tale of the split self, respectable on the surface, destructive beneath. Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness explores colonialism as a collective shadow, exposing brutality hidden beneath claims of civilization. Even children's stories reflect the shadow. In Peter Pan, Captain Hook represents fears of aging and mortality. Fairy tales such as Snow White depict envy and rage in the figure of the wicked queen. These stories allow us to grapple with shadow impulses in symbolic form. Literature serves as a safe arena to confront what we might deny in daily life. By projecting the shadow onto fictional characters, we can explore it at a distance. Yet the lessons return to us. Every monster, villain, or tragic figure reveals something human. Literature insists that the shadow is not foreign, it is part of us. To read deeply is to meet our hidden selves. Philosophy has long wrestled with the problem of human darkness. From ancient thinkers to modern existentialists, the shadow forces us to ask, what does it mean to be human if we carry within us both light and dark? Plato's allegory of the cave can be read as a shadow metaphor. The prisoners mistake shadows on the wall for reality. Only by turning toward the light can they see truth. Yet shadows remain part of their journey. The allegory reminds us that ignorance and illusion are integral to human experience. Nietzsche challenged society to confront the shadow directly. He argued that suppressing instincts leads to weakness, while embracing them with awareness creates strength. His concept of the Übermensch is one who integrates even the darkest drives into creativity and self-mastery. Nietzsche warned that denial of the shadow produces resentment and mediocrity. Freud built his theory of the unconscious on the idea of repressed drives. For him, the shadow appeared in slips of the tongue, dreams, and neurotic behaviors. What we repress does not disappear. It returns in disguised forms. His work paved the way for Jung's deeper exploration of the shadow. Existentialist thinkers like Sartre and Camus highlight the ethical weight of the shadow. They argue that human freedom includes the freedom to confront or ignore darker impulses. Responsibility lies in choosing authenticity, even when it means facing uncomfortable truths. Philosophy teaches that the shadow is not simply psychological, but ontological. It raises questions about what it means to be a self, a moral agent, a human being. To philosophize about the shadow is to confront the conditions of existence itself. The shadow is not only individual, it also manifests at the collective level. Societies project, repress, and deny aspects of themselves just as individuals do. These collective shadows shape politics, history, and culture in profound ways. One example is scapegoating. Throughout history, groups have projected their fears and failures onto outsiders. Witch trials, racial discrimination, and xenophobia all reveal the collective shadow at work. When a society refuses to face its flaws, it creates enemies to carry them instead. War also exposes the collective shadow. Nations justify violence by labeling the enemy as barbaric or evil, denying the same impulses within themselves. The atrocities of the 20th century, from the Holocaust to genocides, reveal what happens when collective shadows go unchecked. Pop culture too reflects the collective shadow. Horror films, dystopian novels, and crime dramas allow society to process fears symbolically. The monsters of cinema often represent anxieties about science, technology, or social change. The popularity of such stories shows how much we need safe outlets for shadow energy. Even social media reveals the collective shadow. Online mobs, cancel culture, and anonymous trolling expose repressed anger and insecurity. The internet amplifies projection, turning private shadows into public spectacles. Recognizing the collective shadow is essential for progress. By acknowledging societal flaws, racism, inequality, violence, communities can begin to transform. Just as individuals must integrate their shadows, so must cultures. The health of a society depends on its ability to face its darkest truths with honesty. The shadow is not only destructive, it can also be profoundly creative. Many of humanity's greatest works of art, literature, and music emerge from struggles with the darker self. Pain, fear, and conflict often fuel imagination. Artists throughout history have drawn from the shadow. Van Gogh's turbulent emotions gave rise to luminous paintings. Dostoevsky transformed his battles with guilt and suffering into profound novels. Sylvia Plath and Edgar Allan Poe wrote from the depths of despair, creating works that still resonate with readers. Music, too, reflects the shadow. Blues and jazz grew from the struggles of marginalized communities. Rock and hip-hop channel anger and rebellion into rhythm and poetry. Classical compositions often capture the full range of human emotion, from sorrow to triumph. The shadow gives art its raw intensity. Creativity is a form of shadow work. By expressing darkness in symbolic form, artists transform pain into beauty. Audiences resonate because they recognize their own shadows in the work. Art becomes a bridge between personal and collective experience. Even ordinary people engage in this process. Journaling, painting, or storytelling allows us to externalize what we might otherwise repress. Creativity does not require fame, only honesty. By acknowledging the shadow as a source of imagination, we expand our understanding of it. The shadow is not merely an obstacle, it is also a wellspring of energy. To deny it is to cut ourselves off from vitality. To embrace it is to live more fully, more authentically, and more creatively. Religions across the world recognize the presence of darkness within humanity. They frame the shadow in terms of sin, temptation, or imbalance, and they offer practices to confront it. To study religious perspectives is to see the shadow not only as psychological, but as profoundly spiritual. In Christianity, the shadow appears as original sin and the struggle between flesh and spirit. The Apostle Paul wrote of wanting to do good, but falling into evil, capturing the tension of divided selfhood. Christian mystics emphasize confession, humility, and forgiveness as ways to integrate the shadow within God's grace. In Buddhism, the shadow emerges as attachment, aversion, and ignorance, the roots of suffering. Instead of repressing them, Buddhism teaches awareness. Through meditation, one sees these impulses without judgment, weakening their hold. The Buddhist path transforms the shadow into compassion and wisdom. In Islam, the concept of the nafs refers to the lower self, desires and ego that resist divine guidance. The spiritual struggle, or jihad al-nafs, is not primarily outward but inward. By disciplining the self, the believer aligns with truth and justice, integrating the shadow under God's mercy. Other traditions echo these themes. Hinduism teaches that ignorance, avidya, clouds the true self. Indigenous practices often involve rituals that confront fear and darkness directly, making them part of the community's spiritual growth. Religion thus frames the shadow not as an enemy, but as a challenge that defines the spiritual path. Without struggle, there is no transformation. The shadow becomes the very site where faith deepens. To engage it is to participate in the drama of the soul. Shadow work is the practice of consciously engaging the hidden parts of the psyche. It is not easy, for it requires honesty, courage, and vulnerability. Yet it is one of the most powerful paths to healing and wholeness. The first step is awareness. Journaling dreams, noticing projections, and observing emotional triggers reveal where the shadow hides. These moments are uncomfortable but precious. They point directly to areas of growth. The second step is acceptance. Instead of condemning the shadow, we acknowledge it as part of the self. Anger, envy, fear, and shame all have roots in real needs or wounds. Acceptance does not mean indulgence, but compassion. The third step is integration. We learn to express shadow traits in constructive ways. Anger becomes assertiveness, envy becomes motivation, fear becomes wisdom. When integrated, the shadow provides balance instead of sabotage. Therapists and healers often guide this process, but it also belongs to ordinary life. Honest conversations with loved ones, reflective practices, and creative expression all invite the shadow into the light. Healing comes when we stop pretending to be only light and allow ourselves to be whole. The shadow is not an intruder, but a neglected part of ourselves. To embrace it is to recover energy, depth, and authenticity. Shadow work does not make us perfect, it makes us real. That reality is the foundation of true healing. Exploring the shadow is not a one-time experience, but a lifelong journey of discovery and integration. To support that journey, I've gathered a set of resources, books, podcasts, and websites that can serve as guides along the way. Each resource approaches the shadow from a different perspective, offering depth, reflection, and practical insight. Books provide the foundation. Carl Jung's Ion and Archetypes and the collective unconscious remain central to understanding his theories of shadow, archetypes, and individuation. Robert A. Johnson's Owning Your Own Shadow translates these complex ideas into a highly accessible guide for personal exploration. James Hollis's Why Good People Do Bad Things digs into the moral dimension of the shadow, showing how even well-intentioned individuals are influenced by repressed impulses. Thomas More's Care of the Soul expands the discussion into the spiritual and poetic, reminding us that our darkness is not simply a problem to solve, but part of the richness of human experience. Khalil Gibran's Solitude and Seclusion offers a literary and meditative perspective, portraying the shadow not as an enemy, but as a partner in the search for wisdom and meaning. These texts remind us that engaging the shadow is as much art and poetry as it is psychology. Podcasts allow us to hear the living conversation. Philosophize This by Stephen West breaks down philosophical theories, including Jung's, in a way that is both digestible and thought-provoking. Hidden Brain by Shankar Vedantam explores the unconscious drives behind our choices. In many ways, a modern engagement with shadow psychology. On Being with Krista Tippett addresses spirituality, ethics, and the human condition, often inviting guests to speak about the darkness and complexity that shape our lives. Websites create a bridge to both scholarship and community. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy provides rigorous academic entries on Jung, Freud, and theories of self. Psychology Today offers accessible articles that show how the shadow appears in everyday relationships, workplaces, and cultural events. The C.G. Jung Institute hosts lectures, courses, and online resources, connecting learners to an ongoing tradition of depth psychology. Each of these resources provides a lens through which to examine the shadow more closely. They don't offer final answers, nor should they. Instead, they open doors. They remind us that the shadow is too vast for any single theory or tradition to capture. By engaging with these materials, you equip yourself with the tools to confront your own hidden impulses with honesty and courage. As you explore them, remember this: shadow work is not about erasing the darkness, but about understanding it. It is about transforming fear into wisdom, repression into compassion, and denial into self-knowledge. These resources can be companions, but the real work always happens within your own heart and mind. They are maps, but you are the traveler. As we come to the end of this exploration of the shadow self, it is important to reflect on what we have uncovered. The shadow, as Carl Jung proposed, is not an external enemy but an inner companion, holding the disowned, repressed, and neglected parts of our being. To face it is not to fall into despair, but to step into wholeness. We do not erase the shadow. Instead, we learn to integrate it, to walk alongside it, and to let it teach us. Throughout this journey, we've seen how the shadow influences our choices, our relationships, and even our sense of morality. When ignored, it can project itself outward, causing conflict and division. But when acknowledged, it becomes a source of energy, creativity, and authenticity. This is the paradox. The very aspects of ourselves that we fear most are often the ones that can help us grow the most. The process of shadow work is never quick or easy. It requires courage, patience, and a willingness to look honestly at the parts of ourselves we wish to deny. It also requires compassion, the ability to hold our flaws with gentleness rather than judgment. When we bring light to the shadow, we discover that darkness was never the opposite of light, but its necessary counterpart. Think of myth, literature, and art. From Dante's descent into the Inferno, to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, to Shakespeare's haunted characters, each reminds us that humanity is defined not by perfection, but by its complexity. To live fully is to embrace both the beauty and the terror of the psyche. In doing so, we become more than fragmented selves, we become whole. So as you leave this episode, I invite you to consider your own shadow. Where does it appear in your thoughts, in your reactions, in your desires? What does it ask of you? How might you walk with it rather than run from it? These are not questions with quick answers, but they are questions worth asking. Remember, confronting the shadow is not about erasing who you are, but about becoming more fully yourself. It is about embracing the totality of your humanity. The work may be uncomfortable, but it is also liberating. For in the dance between light and dark, between the seen and unseen, lies the truth of who we are. Thank you for joining me on this exploration. Until next time, may you walk with both your light and your shadow, not as enemies, but as companions in the search for wholeness.